Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and today we're going to be taking a look at Green-White Devotion for the Khans of Tarkir Season of Standard. So the sweet thing about Green-White Devotion that separates it from like Green-Black Devotion or even Mono-Green Devotion is that this deck is a little bit more resilient whenever it comes to actually playing against threats like End Hostilities. Cards like that are board wipes tend to just gonna give the Mono-Green decks a hard time because you're playing this strategy where you're just ramping, you're putting creatures out onto the table, and you're using those towards your advantage to actually gain momentum. But if your opponent has a way to just clear the entire board, then you're not really getting anywhere, and you pretty much wasted a whole bunch of turns. So the solution to that was to actually end up playing white here, so we can play Elspeth Sun's Champion, and also to be able to play like Ajani in the sideboard as a sort of tutor. But otherwise, we're also able to play Banishing Light in this deck, which synergizes with the Eidolon of Blossoms that we're playing here. And I actually played this deck back in the Journey into Nyx season of Standard. However, at that time I was playing Ajani, wasn't playing the Elspeth, and pretty much concluded after playing the deck for a while that Elspeth really was the best solution for this type of deck and for the style that we have going on here. However, the deck even then had a rough time because you had to play against Supreme Verdict. So now the deck is a whole lot better, and we'll jump right on into it with Elvish Mystic being our first card here. So we have a lot of mana dorks. Elvish Mystic is pretty much like the most common one that we have that we can play on turn 1, allowing us to play like Courser of Kruphix on turn 2. So 1/1 for 1 green, taps for 1 green to our mana pool. We have a playset of Sylvan Caryatid, 0/3 for 2, Defender Hexproof, produces any color of mana for us, which is great, so we can get a source of white for our Elspeth that we can ramp into. We have a playset of Voyaging Satyr, 1/2 for 2, and tap to untap target land, which provides for some interesting and intricate synergies with Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, so we're able to use the Satyr to untap our Nykthos, and then based on what we have on our battlefield as far as Devotion to Green goes, we can essentially just produce a massive amount of mana, and we can siphon it into a couple of different cards. The most common one is actually our next card, Genesis Hydra. So Genesis Hydra is X and double green, and whenever we are casting our Genesis Hydra, we are going to reveal our top X cards of our library, and we can put a permanent with converted mana cost X or less from among those cards out onto the battlefield. So if our Genesis Hydra is big enough, we can get a free Elspeth off of it, like if the X value is 6 or 7 or something like that, which usually isn't a hard thing to actually accomplish. We're able to get a free Planeswalker. Another sweet thing, because of the removal that we do have with Banishing Light, if we do reveal a Banishing Light among those X cards, we're able to find some removal for something that our opponent's playing. Or otherwise, we can just find like a Hornet Queen or another threat that we're playing in our deck that would be pretty common to just kind of build up our board state. But Genesis Hydra is probably like one of the better cards in this deck just because you're able to utilize the massive amount of mana that you're actually able to produce, and you're pretty much going to make 2 threats out of 1 card. Our next card is Courser of Kruphix, so we have a playset of it, 2/4 for 3. We are essentially playing lands off the top of our library, which gets us closer to the actual threats that we want to be finding off the top of our library. The nice thing about Courser is that we're just digging, and at the same time we're gaining life, so even against some of the more like aggressive tempo matchups, the Courser can provide a little bit of leverage for us with that life gain. But otherwise, it's also a enchantment creature, so it synergizes with our Eidolon of Blossoms. So Eidolon of Blossoms, 2/2 for 4, and off of Constellation, whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under our control, we're going to be able to draw a card. So the Eidolon is easily one of the greatest engines that this deck has towards drawing cards, so playing more Eidolons ensures us that we're able to draw into more things and actually have more threats. And even if our opponent has solutions and answers as far as 1-for-1 removal goes, the Eidolon is pretty much going to make it so that we have more actual threats and we're able to actually have the upper hand on our opponent. As far as our more concrete threats go, we have Polukranos, World Leader, so 5/5 for 4, and he has the monstrous ability for X where he can eat smaller creatures for the most part. Given how much mana we can produce with this deck, you can actually sink a massive amount of mana into the Polukranos and just be able to pump them up really huge. And you can even take like 1 or 2 sizable or more sizable creatures of your opponents based on having a massive amount of green devotion, which usually is the case. We also have 3 Hornet Queen, which is starting to become more and more of a popular card. It's just such a blowout for most decks. 2/2 for 7 mana, 4 and 3 green, flying, death touch, and whenever it enters the battlefield, we get 4 1/1 green insect tokens with flying and death touch onto the battlefield. So Hornet Queen is easily one of the best answers that we have to cards like Stormbreath Dragon, and it's even just great whenever you have to like block Sarkhan for a couple of turns or stuff like that. It's just great against like Mantis Rider and pretty much like all of the evasion creatures that are in the format, and it blocks things extremely well. We also have 3 Banishing Light, which we mentioned before. The Banishing Light synergizes with Eidolon of Blossoms. It's great if you're revealing it off of a Genesis Hydra. It's a removal that doesn't get passed up like Hero's Downfall or something like that. But otherwise, Banishing Light's just great. It gets rid of planeswalkers, it gets rid of creatures, so it's pretty much useful for us either if we're revealing it off of a Genesis Hydra or if we're just drawing it to draw it and actually get rid of something of our opponents. And then we have 3 Elspeth Sun's Champion for our last actual spell of the deck. So the Elspeth is great just because it produces tokens. If our opponent's playing End Hostilities and they get rid of like our board that has Mystics and Caryatids and Coursers and whatnot, if we still have an Elspeth on the board, we're still able to produce tokens, and it's a threat that your opponent has to answer or else it's going to get out of hand. If we can land an emblem, that's really great. But usually just producing the tokens and putting pressure on the board is exactly what we want to do with this Elspeth. And pretty much it was the biggest actual answer to End Hostilities that you have as far as like splashing colors go. So the Elspeth ended up being like the best possible thing, even better than like Ajani as far as the main board goes. And ultimately, it's just really good against a lot of different matchups, like playing against a bunch of Siege Rhinos, it's really good, and playing up against like Butchers and whatnot. If your opponent's just playing a lot of value fatties, then you're able to wipe the board with a -3, especially if the board gets out of hand where you can't usually deal with things as far as like your own creatures and your threats go, and your opponent's just kind of stacking more things out onto the table. You wait for them to overextend, and then you -3 and get rid of like all of the creatures with power 4 or greater, and you give yourself a little bit of a better position and some more breathing room to be able to do stuff. Now, for the actual lands of the deck, we are playing 4 Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, which is our mana generator, our biggest one for the deck, and it's pretty much what makes this whole deck come together and work really well. There are games where you don't see the Nykthos and you can still produce a ton of mana and ramp a whole ton with your mana dorks, but otherwise Nykthos is usually the biggest proponent and actual catalyst towards making mana here. We have a playset of Windswept Heath, so we're not actually playing very many cards from Khans of Tark here, but Windswept Heath is one of them. The other one is actually the Hooded Hydra that we have in the sideboard. But the Windswept Heath allowing us to fetch up for our forests that we have as far as basic lands go, or our singleton plains. We have a playset of Temple of Plenty to allow us to scry and also provide some white mana for us. We have 11 forests in the deck and 1 singleton plains. And then as far as the sideboard goes, we have some planeswalkers to start things off, because in the matchups where your opponent is going to be playing board wipes and cards that are going to wipe our board pretty efficiently, we want to have ways to just kind of be able to stabilize or have some threats on different angles where your opponent has to not only worry about your creatures but also your planeswalkers. So the first card that we have is Nissa Worldwaker. So the Nissa seemed kind of like the best possible option that we have, because it also allows us to ramp on top of creating threats for us each turn by turning our lands into 4/4s. The ultimate doesn't happen very often, and you kind of have to be cautious with the ultimate, just because if you go and you just fetch up all of your lands and they're all 4/4s and then your opponent has a way to get rid of all of them, then you're kind of in a really bad position. But otherwise, the Nissa just being able to make like 4/4s out of your lands, especially like even if you're getting flooded, it's really good. But being able to untap as well is just a kind of more useful way to be able to interact with cards like Genesis Hydra, or even giving yourself like a little bit more of a value out of like the Polukranos X values and whatnot. We have a Ajani Mentor of Heroes here as well. So the Ajani is pretty good up against matchups where your opponent is just like getting rid of your board because he is a tutor. But at the same time, Ajani is also good if you're playing against Anger of the Gods, which is kind of a awkward card to have to play against because you have so many creatures that actually die, especially like your Mana Makers and Eidolon of the Blossoms. So the Ajani being able to distribute +1/+1 counters makes your creatures a little bit bigger and more resilient against Anger of the Gods, which is really, really great because some of the red decks love to side that card in because it gets rid of like Hornet Queen, your Mana Makers, and Eidolon. So the Ajani makes your creatures a little bit bigger, a little bit more resilient, even in like the mirror match or like equivalent like monster decks that you would be facing up against. Making your creatures bigger than your opponents is always just great. So the Ajani functioning as making your creatures bigger or as a tutor is just wonderful. The gaining 100 life is relevant most times, but you really don't get to it a whole lot. But if it does happen, it's just kind of like an insurance policy that you're up ahead of your opponent. As far as the rest of the sideboard goes, we have 2 Arbor Colossus. So the Arbor Colossus is great for the matchups where your opponent has a lot of flyers. So the Arbor Colossus is efficient in blocking things like Mantis Rider, Sarkon, Stormbreath Dragon, cards like those. It's even great at killing cards like Stormbreath Dragon as well. So one of the biggest matchups that I've been siding the Arbor Colossus in against has been the Jeskai Tempo deck, just because you're able to block with Reach. And it's just so good against so many of their cards, and it's very hard to kill because it has 6 toughness. Our next card is Unravel the AEther, so this one is kind of variable as to where it's useful. The Unravel the AEther is great for the Jeskai combo deck, just because you kind of unpiece their combo and you get to break apart their stuff. It's also good against the mirror match, especially if your opponent is playing Doomwake Giant, so you're able to bounce back their Doomwake Giant and shuffle it into their library. It's really, really great for that. And while you're doing that, you're also able to like shuffle back their Eidolons or their Coursers and just screw things up for them. So there's a little bit of interaction that you have with like the mirror match and the constellation that your opponent may be playing, but for the most part, like any deck that's playing a lot of like efficient artifacts or enchantments and stuff, you're able to just kind of break apart what they're trying to do, or just even throw off their stuff. Especially if your opponent's playing like fetch lands, and like you know what they have off of like a Courser, and like they fetch a land and they reveal something really awesome off of the fetch land after they shuffle, and it's revealed to you off of Courser, then you're just able to shuffle the Courser in and then just screw up that draw for them. So there are some small interactions like that are present. We have Nylea's Disciple as our next card as a playset. So pretty much like the easiest card to side in as far as aggro goes, because your devotion to green is going to be so huge. The amount of life that you gain off of Nylea's Disciple is just absolutely massive. So you gain life equal to your devotion to green whenever it enters the battlefield. It itself adds to your devotion, and it pretty much just kind of sets you really, really high up ahead of any of like the tempo or the aggro matchups, where even just like resolving 1 or 2 of these pretty much gives you a game win most times. The next card is Hooded Hydra. So Hooded Hydra is kind of an interesting card because it doesn't really come across anybody's radar as being like this huge threat or like this really useful card, and it doesn't really see any play. However, this card's actually really good up against the matchups where your opponent has like 1-for-1 removal, but doesn't necessarily have removal for a lot of your creatures across the board. So it's another sync like our Genesis Hydra, where we can put in like X amount of mana into it on top of the double green. And whenever it dies, we get 1/1 green snakes equal to the +1/+1 counters that are actually on the Hooded Hydra. So against the decks that don't have counter spells, it's really great. If they're playing things like Hero's Downfall and stuff to be able to get rid of your creatures. The Hooded Hydra is just wonderful. You don't lose out like Genesis Hydra, where you're like, all right, well, I'll sink this much mana into it, get like a free Courser, and then your opponent's like, all right, well, I'll kill your creature. With Hooded Hydra, you at least get a bunch of 1/1s on the battlefield, and you just get to kind of flood and swarm the board. As for the last two cards that we have in here, they're more so centered for like the mirror match than anything else. However, Bow of Nylea is really good for a lot of different implications. So it's really good against the control matchup because you get to put any threats that you have that are in your graveyard on the bottom of your library. You can crack a fetch and then you can shuffle those like back into your library anywhere. So it gives you the possibility of drawing those cards again and just kind of recycling resources. It's good against the aggro matchup because it's another way for us to gain life, and being able to gain life every single turn is wonderful. But for like the mirror match and the other big like mid-range decks, all of your creatures having Death Touch whenever they're attacking is just really, really great. And also being able to distribute +1/+1 counters every single turn and make your creatures bigger is kind of like the Ajani in just making sure that your creatures are always bigger than your opponents. And then the last card is Setessan Tactics. So a card that is more so for like the mirror matches and where you want to be like trading cards and you want to be like killing off your opponent's value creatures than anything else. So 1/1 green, it has a strive cost of 1 green. And until the end of the turn, any number of target creatures each get +1/+1 and have tap. This creature fights another target creature. So if it's the case of like you giving Setessan Tactics to multiple Hornet Queen tokens so that they can kill off like 3 of your opponent's big value creatures, so be it. That's exactly what we want to be doing with this type of a card, or even like your Polukranos being 1 point of power and toughness greater than your opponent's, and it being able to kill off that creature. Setessan Tactics is perfect for those types of trades, and honestly, most of the time you can just have a massive blowout with a Setessan Tactics as far as just flipping the table goes. So that is our deck tech for Green-White Devotion for the Khans of Tarkir Season of Standard. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this deck tech. If you did, I would appreciate it if you guys thumbs up the video and subscribe to the channel for more Magic the Gathering content. But until next time, guys, thank you for watching, and peace out.
If you guys want to keep up to date with everything that we have going on here at Absolute MTG, remember to hit that subscribe button, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter for all of your Magic the Gathering needs. Also, remember to check out our sponsors of the channel, MTG Madness and ABUGames.com. But as always, thank you guys for watching.